Somewhere north of the border, water is falling through granite right now, and that falling water is the reason your truck bed, your soda can, and the wing of the plane you flew in on all exist. Nobody tells you that when you buy a car. Nobody tells you that when you crack open a beer. But it is true, and it has been true for over a century. And in the last few years, it has quietly become one of the most dangerous points of leverage one country has ever held over another without a single soldier or a single missile involved. Canada supplies more than half of every pound of raw aluminum the United States brings in from outside its own borders. Not steel, not oil, aluminum, the metal in your kitchen foil, your window frames, your phone casing, your car door, and the fuselage of nearly every commercial jet built in America. And almost none of that metal is being made on American soil anymore, because the thing you need most to make aluminum isn't rock, and it isn't labor. It's electricity. Staggering amounts of it. More electricity per ton than almost any other industrial process on Earth. And the cheapest, most abundant electricity on the entire continent doesn't come from a Texas gas plant or a Pennsylvania coal seam. It comes from rivers in Quebec and British Columbia that have been turning turbines since before most Americans alive today were born. This didn't happen by accident, and it didn't happen recently. Go back over 100 years to a river in northern Quebec that drops more than 100 feet over a rock shelf, so violent that the water itself could power a small city just by falling. American and Canadian industrialists built a smelter right on top of that drop in the early 1900s, not because the ore was better there, but because the power was free, basically forever. Then came a second event that welded the two countries together even tighter, a world war that needed bombers, fighters, and boats built almost entirely out of aluminum skin. Canadian smelters ran around the clock, producing more than half the aluminum used by the entire Allied war effort. The rivets on the aircraft that flew missions over Europe were holding together metal that started as electricity running through Quebec's turbines. That wartime bargain never really ended. It just got quieter. Decade after decade, American smelters kept closing because they couldn't compete with power that cheap, and Canadian production kept climbing to fill the gap nobody in Washington seemed to notice was opening. Here's where it stands today. The United States uses somewhere north of 9 million metric tons of aluminum a year. About a third of that, several million tons, rolls south across the border every single year, arriving by rail and by freighter before it ever touches an American factory floor. There are only two large primary aluminum smelters still operating in the entire United States. 2. Meanwhile, Canada is running more than a dozen, each one sitting on hydroelectric power that costs a fraction of what an American factory pays for the same kilowatt hour. That price gap isn't small. Electricity for an aluminum smelter in Quebec can cost roughly a third, sometimes less, of what the same power costs in most of the United States. When your raw material is essentially frozen electricity, that gap isn't a rounding error. It's the entire business case, and it's the reason nearly every rolling mill, every can plant, every aerospace parts supplier, and every auto stamping line in America is quietly dependent on metal that started its life falling through a Canadian river. Now here's the part that should genuinely worry you, because it isn't abstract policy, it's your everyday life. Aerospace companies building the wings and frames of the planes flying over your house right now depend on Canadian rolled aluminum plate. The trucks and SUVs rolling off American assembly lines get their body panels from sheet metal that started as Canadian ingot. And the beverage industry, every soda, every beer, every seltzer can produced in America, pulls the overwhelming majority of its aluminum from the same source. Some independent estimates put the number of American jobs tied directly or indirectly to this one supply chain at well over 500,000 people, spread across states that most people wouldn't automatically connect to a Canadian river. So when a tariff gets slapped onto that metal at the stroke of a pen in Washington, it doesn't create a new American factory. It can't. Building a single primary aluminum smelter from scratch costs close to $1 billion and takes the better part of a decade, assuming you can even find cheap enough power to run it, which in most of the United States you simply cannot. So what actually happens instead is prices rise on everything downstream. Cars get more expensive to build, beverage companies pay more for cans, aerospace suppliers eat higher costs or pass them along. The tariff doesn't punish Canada. It taxes the American consumer, the American manufacturer, and the American worker, while the actual physical bottleneck, the rivers, the turbines, the smelters, sits exactly where it's always been, completely unaffected by a signature on a piece of paper in Washington. And this is the part almost nobody is talking about publicly. The leaders in Ottawa know this. They've known it for years. Every time a trade fight flares up between the two countries, aluminum sits quietly in the background as one of the few cards Canada can play that genuinely cannot be countered quickly. Not with a speech, not with an executive order, not even with a new trade deal signed overnight. Because you cannot negotiate your way out of 100 years of geography. The rivers flow where they flow. The power is where it is. And whoever controls that river-fed electricity controls how fast, how expensive, and how reliable the flow of a metal that touches almost every part of modern American life really is. Which raises the question nobody in this conversation seems to want to answer out loud. If this is the leverage sitting quietly in the background of every trade dispute between these two countries, what happens the day someone in Ottawa actually decides to use it, not as a threat, but for real? That's exactly where this story is headed next.